Hi there everyone, welcome back to the Soterion Technical Series, where we break down SAP Security and Authorization Administration into short, practical how-to videos. Each episode focuses on an SAP tool, function, or concept, helping you understand what it does, when to use it, and how to apply it in practice. In this episode, we'll be covering the SAP Authorisation Trace, otherwise known as the STUSOBTRACE, the SAP transaction behind this, which is essentially a authorization trace at the SAP application level, showing you what authorization checks a specific SAP application performs during its runtime or processing within the underlying program. So that ties to transaction codes, Fiori OData services, RFC function modules, background jobs, anything of the sort. This trace is designed to record the authority checks made during use of that application. Right, let's share and let's get into SAP where we can go through some examples. Just a reminder that if you haven't taken a look at any of our, or if you haven't seen any of our technical series episodes on the Soterion YouTube channel as of yet, I'm sure you'll find a lot of use in a few of them. The recent episodes that we've put out is all around SAP authorization tracing. The last two episodes tying to the STUSOBTRACE and STUSERTRACE for user authorization analysis and within SAP, whereas today we're focusing on the application level. So similar to the STUSOBTRACE that we discussed in our last episode, the STUSOBTRACE has an underlying system parameter that needs to be maintained before it can be used. All right. So when we talk about system parameters, what we're aware of is that parameters can be made either set dynamically in a system where the change is made in the active profile of, or the dynamic profile of the system. That change is then in effect until the next server restart, after which the parameter value is set to the system default or reset to the system default, whereas in the static profile, parameter profile of the system, that value remains through the server restart. So you're effectively setting a new default for the system. And as such, our trace parameters, they are available in both the static and the dynamic profiles of the system. What we recommend, as these traces are long-term traces, they are intended to remain active for a long period of time, and we'll get more into that shortly. We recommend that the trace is set both dynamically or in the active profile, active dynamic profile of the system, so that the trace value or change the trace value takes effect immediately, but also set in the static profile of the system, so that after the next system restart, we don't need to worry about resetting or reapplying that value in the dynamic profile. The trace will continue to record even through the upcoming server restarts. As such, what I'll do is just give a quick demonstration of this. So the parameter name that is behind our application user trace is the Auth/authorization trace parameter. When we display this parameter, I've come into the dynamic profile being behind transaction RZ11. RZ10 is used to update or maintain your static profile. If you have interest in activating these parameters, that I'm sure will be a request to your basis user or the person responsible for your basis administration at your organization to help you set these parameters. All right, we can see here that the default is set to a Y. If I want to change that value, I can then apply the values as such in this view over here. Just a touch on the values. So we have possible values of an N, meaning that that is not active or it is off, or a value of Y, meaning that yes, the parameter is active and there are no dependencies on filters within the trace before that trace can start recording. And then of course we have the value of F, meaning that the trace can be activated, but only through the front end of the trace transaction, STUSOBTRACE, where we apply the filter for our trace criteria, and the trace will only start recording information once we've applied that filter. The F value is pretty useful and recommended for a number of reasons. Number one is that, of course, you can set the parameter to a value of F, and that means the trace is not recording any information until there has been an action made from the front end of that transaction. So if I set it to a Y, that means the trace is going to start recording immediately. Although these traces are designed as long-term traces and designed with mitigations in place to prevent the trace from growing exponentially large and causing system performance issues, there are still scenarios where that can happen for an organization. Of course, every organization has different memory capacities and limitations applied to their system. So it's not a set kind of this is the limit of this trace can go. But of course, if there are extreme amounts of records in the system or in these traced underlying database tables, that can then have a negative impact on the SAP end user experience during runtime of the applications. So what we will recommend is setting it to an F, meaning that only once I've applied my restrictions and I've applied the information that I want to restrict on, then the trace can run, and we're going to be confident that it's not going to grow exponentially large and cause those issues for our end users. So as such, we recommend the value of F mainly for the user trace, because effectively the user trace is every authority check made at the application level per user. So we typically see quite a large volume of records in that trace data set. However, when we get to the application level trace, typically I would recommend a value of Y over here, because it's not auth checks per application per user. So effectively an application's auth checks could be duplicated or multiplied by the number of users you have in your system. This is purely at the application level. So that's far less data records that need to be written to the system, and therefore typically not as much of a concern with leaving that trace to run unrestricted. So let's set that value or just demonstrate the value of the trace being active, currently activated, unrestricted in our environment. And let's now take a look at the trace application or trace transaction itself, STUSOBTRACE. Right, STUSOBTRACE, basically the front screen here, we've got the active without filters. So that's the representation of the filter, or that's the representation of the parameter value being Y, meaning that the trace can just be active without any filters. If it was an F, it would say filter, with filters applied. We see we do have a filter applied here to show that we're only recording checks for transaction codes at the moment. And then different to our STUSOBTRACE, there is a more limited set of restrictions for evaluation, because again, we're not looking at the user level, we're only looking at the application level. Let's say I wanted to find all the authority checks linked to transaction SU01, right? I'm going to not apply any auth object or date and time restrictions, and I'm going to evaluate our checks. All right, so here we see all of the unique auth object or authorized authority checks performed by our application. So SU01 here, we can see that there are a bunch of authority checks and possible field values that were used in our results list over here. So about 2,000 unique checks. And that is, of course, what mitigates these traces and kind of allows them to be long-term traces, is that only the first time a authority check is executed, that is recorded in the trace values. Any replication or duplicate authority checks made against this application will not be recorded or added to the database table. So that way we have a complete unique set of authority checks, including the auth object, the fields and their values. And then later on, we've got the date and timestamp that this was added, as well as who it was changed by. So who was the user that actually executed this the first time. What I do want to draw attention to, right, in this view over here, is that do not place too much reliance on the user that changed this, because it will log the first user that made the change, but not the users since or the last user that has made that change. So I wouldn't place too much reliance on filtering out records here that were only contributed to by a certain user. For instance, if I had an idea that I wanted to build a role or build a authorization default profile in SU24 based on authority checks that were contributed to by this transaction by business as usual users, so no firefighter users, no support users, I could come to this trace results and maybe try and exclude all my firefighter users or perhaps my developer users from the trace results. But in this instance, just because developer 1 was the first user to log this authority check, that doesn't mean that a consultant or a business as usual user logged in the next day or few days or seconds after this was made and then executed the same check. This report is purely just intended to show you what are the possible authority checks made by a certain application, and for you to then consider whether or not these should be included in the authorization default of that application, or perhaps a role containing that application. What are the authorization defaults that could potentially be checked by this application, or that we may want to include in a role profile or set of roles? Another way of kind of analyzing is not only from a transaction perspective or application perspective, but also from a authorization object perspective. So I want to find all applications that call on a specific authorization object. You can see here the list of all the auth objects that call on the SAP applications or transaction codes that call on this specific object. And then I can make use of my data filtering to start applying restrictions. So I want to find all applications that call on this object in the context of activity 01 or creating of documents. I can then filter for these applications and get that information. So many use cases here in terms of perhaps maybe licensing impact being we know that in S4HANA, licenses are tied to authorization objects and field values. So I would like to understand what are the applications in my environment that are actually using these high tier license authority values. I can actually use the STUSOBTRACE to identify which of those applications are executing them as part of their program authority checks, as well as, and then maybe be able to identify, okay, these are the applications that need to be removed from certain users because they shouldn't have them to be, flagged as a certain license type. As well as then just general authorization administration tasks. A user or a business owner might want to understand who can create sales documents. We know that that's 01 in a specific authorization object. We can then filter for that using this to find the applications that allow for that, and then take that further into remediation actions or exercises. Right, pretty straightforward. And I think that's all that we have today for the STUSOBTRACE. Just want to thank you again as our viewers. We hope that you're taking some value from these sessions. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any more questions or would like to go into more in-depth discussion around any of the SAP tools that we put on show here in the technical series. And be sure to check out our past and future episodes. I hope that we see you again. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.